Connecting the world, the Skype saga. Now, retirement's a strange thing. Sometimes there's a big party, a celebration of a working life and the chance to remember major contributions and how much someone has influenced the lives of others. Sometimes it's just a quiet slipping away, a gentle closing of the door behind you, and a drifting off into other worlds. Microsoft seems to have arranged a version of the latter to mark the fading away of an innovation which began life in the back rooms of a couple of programmers and their chums from the Baltic region. Yet it ended up changing the world. You may not even have noticed, but last month, May, saw the formal retirement of Skype. Once such a dominant force in communications that we'd happily talk about Skyping someone, but something which now has been overtaken by a whole new generation of platforms and networks. So before the memory fades completely, it might be worth reflecting on the Skype story and some of the lessons it might offer us about innovation. Starting with the fact that, as the poet T.S. Eliot memorably put it, our beginnings never know their ends. Because Skype began a long way from the world of communications. Once upon a time, there was music, lots of it, and a world hungry for it. In fact, the music part has been around a very long time, at least as far back as 40,000 years, when archaeologists suggest the first primitive instruments were in use. Homer suggests that the god Hermes invented the lyre by stretching animal sinews across a tortoise shell and letting the wind work its magic. Anyway, we've always loved to listen to music. The trouble is that it's hard to recreate that experience if we were unlucky enough to miss the original performance. So the challenge is how to capture and share it. And that's something which has been a long-running spur to innovation, with plenty of stepping stones along the way. We've had the idea of sound reproduction for nearly 200 years, although Edward Leon Scott, who was the inventor in 1857 of the phonograph, didn't think we'd actually want to listen. He thought, strangely, that we'd be content with looking at traces scrawled on paper emerging from his machine as it captured the incoming sound. So while he technically invented recording, it wasn't really till Thomas Edison in 1877 added the possibility of playback that things really began to happen. And the rest is history. Or rather a series of challenges to improve on those basic inventions, not least in terms of how we store and manipulate the recordings. Wax cylinders gave way to shellac discs, which improved in capacity and reliability as new materials became available. Other options emerged, such as magnetic oxide coated on tapes, or optically readable compact discs using lasers, and eventually to digital media. The trouble is that fidelity, which in Edison's day was pretty low, can only get higher at the expense of having big files carrying the recorded information. Now, to put that in perspective, by the 1980s, when a German student, Karl-Heinz Brandenburg, began working on this topic for his PhD, it took 10 hours for a mainframe computer to decode 1 minute of digitized music. Now, this was a big barrier. Many people could see the possibilities in digital media in fields like music and films, but it wasn't going to happen if this storage problem couldn't be solved. And fitting a mainframe computer in the average living room would be something of a squeeze. Which takes us to the unlikely location of Tom's Diner. Now, that's a fictitious hangout, but an important stepping stone in the world of sound reproduction. Because Suzanne Vega's 1982 hit record offered more than a hummable hook. Its combination of breathy contralto and backbeat provided Karl-Heinz with a good test for his ideas on how to solve the storage problem. As he explains, I was ready to fine-tune my compression algorithm. Somewhere down the corridor, a radio was playing Tom's Diner, and I was electrified. I knew it would be nearly impossible to compress this warm a cappella voice. Now, Karl-Heinz was trying a novel approach based on psychoacoustics. That's a field which looks at how humans hear, or sometimes don't hear, things. And he realized that by filtering out many of the sounds, people would still accept the quality of the remaining audio. So he could reduce the size of the files needed dramatically, if he could work out precisely which sounds to leave out and encode the audio. By 1989, he had his PhD and a German patent on his approach. In 1993, he moved across to work full-time at the Fraunhofer Institute for Integrated Circuits, where a team were working on sound reproduction technology. He bought a key piece of the puzzle, his compression algorithm. Now, in terms of christening cards, it wasn't much, just a short email informing the team about how to refer to their work in the future correspondence. The International Motion Pictures Expert Group, MPEG, was a community of practice linked to the International Standards Organization, and it was concerned with this challenge of digital compression of sound and images. Now, they developed a series of layers around a standard model, and Karl-Heinz thought his algorithm would work as a standard for level 3, MPEG level 3. And so, on July the 14th, 1995, the MP3 was born. It proved to be revolutionary in its impact, and not just on the ability to make high-quality sound available on personal devices. Because once word got out about the MP3 standard, people began to take an interest, not least in the world of personal computing. Now, as well as discussions with the major producers of sound equipment and the big music industry players, the Fraunhofer Institute tried some early online marketing of a product to try and reach this hobbyist community. They were offering licenses to home users, and a product was called WinPlay 3, launched in September 1995 with a modest price of around $50, targeted, as the name suggests, at PC users running Windows. It wasn't a runaway success. In fact, general reception was lukewarm, not least because of the lack of an exciting user interface. But releasing software across the internet carried risks even then, especially in an environment where wares, that's to say the illegal sharing of files, that wares community were experimenting with sharing music, albeit in uncompressed formats, which didn't really lend themselves to widespread activity. An Australian hacker under the pseudonym Solo H bought a copy of Fraunhofer's WinPlay 3 using a stolen credit card, and then worked his way back, rummaging around files at the university where Karl-Heinz had originally worked to find the original source code. Solo H then tweaked it a little and released a freeware version. At least he had some remorse, because he named that distro Thank You Fraunhofer. From a business point of view, this was bad news. The Fraunhofer team eventually retreated to a position where they continued to license the encoder, but accepted that the player element of their software was now well and truly out there. From a diffusion of innovation angle, it was the turning point. The software spread quickly and was hacked further. In particular, a programmer called Thomas Uzelac from Croatia came up with his AMP MP3 player in 1997. He released it initially as freeware, but then later partnered with a US media entrepreneur, Brian Littman, to try and commercialize it. Unfortunately, the cat, or rather the software, was well and truly out of the bag by this time, and had already taken up residence with, amongst others, a US entrepreneur, Justin Frankel, who licensed the AMP engine in June 1997, and by 1998 had set up his company, Nullsoft, with Dmitry Boldreev, and created Winamp, another freeware player for MP3. They quickly learned with the market, adapted their product, adding skins, playlists, other features, so it quickly became a runaway success, despite their charging $10 as a shareware fee. Winamp 1 sold over 3 million copies very quickly, and Winamp 2, launched a year later, was one of the most popular Windows applications. Nullsoft was eventually sold to AOL in 1999 for $80 million, and by 2000 it had 25 million users, a year later 60 million. But something else was happening across this emerging platform which would shake the foundations of the music industry itself. The big difference between digital music and physical versions is that when you lend your album to someone else, there's still only one copy. But if you share the file, there are 2 copies. And if your friend shares with a couple of others, then there are 4, then 16, and so on. So these fluid conditions opened up the possibility for further innovation, enabling sharing in more systematic and widespread fashion. Enter Sean Parker and Sean Fanning, who launched a site in 1999 called Napster, named after Fanning's nickname. And this pioneered the idea of peer-to-peer, P2P networking, and opened up the possibilities of widespread file sharing. Within a year of its launch, there were close to 30 million users, and some network providers to US colleges calculated that 2/3 of their bandwidth was being used by students swapping files. Now, at this scale, it was inevitable that the music industry would fight back. And when the band Metallica found that their song I Disappear had been played in illegal MP3 format on radio stations weeks before its official release, it triggered the response. On December the 6th, 1999, the Recording Industry of America filed a lawsuit against Napster. They won, but that didn't stop the problem, even though it eventually resulted in Napster's bankruptcy. Napster's model was based on the idea of a centralized server managing the flow of P2P activity, which meant it could be shut down. But innovation didn't stop. Instead, it moved towards creating models based on decentralized peer-to-peer networking. And as companies like LimeWire, Grokster, and Gnutella discovered, it was much harder to pull the plug on such activity if there were so many servers that there was effectively no master plug. Entrepreneurs explored different models, just staying ahead of the growing legal enforcement process, just far enough to make money and spread the file sharing practice further. Subnodes, nodes, and supernodes proliferated, and file sharing grew. In desperation, the recording industry began trying to broaden its attack, from suing the companies to chasing workplaces and schools where file sharing could be shown to have happened. And eventually to criminalizing the individuals, threatening hefty fines, even criminal charges. Not necessarily the best public relations when you're bullying the very people you're trying to persuade to buy your product legally. At this point, enter Niklas Zennström from Sweden and Janus Friis from Denmark. Around the year 2000, they developed and launched Kazaa, another peer-to-peer file sharing service. Now, Kazaa was a software application that allowed users to share files directly with each other over the internet. It utilized a decentralized P2P network, so files were stored on individual users' computers, and then the Kazaa software facilitated searching for and downloading these files directly from other users also running the software. Not surprisingly, Kazaa quickly became popular, attracting millions of users looking to download music, movies, software, other digital files for free. Its popularity surged, particularly after Napster was forced offline due to those copyright infringement lawsuits. Kazaa operated on something called the Fast Track Protocol, a P2P technology that they developed with their team. Now, although Kazaa was a success story, it operated in an increasingly crowded market, one which was challenged by growing respectability, especially that conferred by Steve Jobs and Apple's iTunes, which had pioneered an alternative and legal approach to digital music sharing. Launched as a simple player in 2001, it was backed up by legal agreements for licensing and selling compressed music files, using their version of an MP3 approach. Zennström and Friis saw the writing on the wall for music file sharing, and they began looking for an alternative field to explore, building on that rich experience which they'd gained in P2P networking. Now, Zennström had a background in business administration and engineering physics, and Friis was a self-taught programmer who started at an internet service provider help desk. And they both shared a vision of leveraging the power of the internet to make communication free, or at least significantly cheaper. Their experience with P2P technology, which they'd gained from Kazaa, directly influenced their approach to voice communication. They realized that a decentralized P2P network could bypass the need for expensive centralized infrastructure, which happened to be the basis of the traditional telecom company's operation. Teaming up with a group of Estonian developers, Arti Heinla, Priiti Kasasalo, and Jean Tallinn, who had been instrumental in developing the Kazaa client, they set out to build a P2P voice over IP, VoIP service. The core idea was simple: use the internet to allow users to make voice calls from computer to computer for free, and offer low-cost calls from computers to traditional phone lines, a service later known as Skype out, for those kind of calls. The initial technology behind Skype was its innovative and somewhat opaque P2P architecture. Unlike traditional voice over IP services that were still relying on centralized servers to route calls, Skype's network was distributed amongst its users' computers. When a user initiated a call, the Skype software on their computer would locate the recipient's computer through this P2P network. The audio data would then flow directly between the computers, or in some cases, be relayed through other Skype users, acting as supernodes, third parties within the network. Now, in essence, their fast track protocol that they developed earlier for Kazaa provided the blueprint for building this large-scale decentralized network. The architecture allowed Skype to offer free and cheap calls by leveraging users' own internet connections and their processing power. And that, of course, bypassed the expensive infrastructure of the traditional telecom companies, much like Kazaa had bypassed the traditional distribution channels for music media. The advantages of this P2P approach in the early days were significant. For example, it meant lower infrastructure costs. By distributing the network load amongst users, Skype drastically reduced the need for expensive server infrastructures compared to those traditional telecom centralized voice over IP providers. And that allowed them to offer free computer-to-computer calls and keep the costs of calls to landlines and to mobiles very low. It also gave them scalability. As more users joined the network's capacity and resilience increased. Each new user brought additional bandwidth and processing power, contributing to the overall network's strength. It also meant that they could circumvent traditional networks. Their P2P architecture allowed Skype to operate largely outside the traditional telecommunications infrastructure and its associated regulations and fees. And certainly this in the early days was a key factor in offering low-cost international calls. But the P2P architecture also had potential disadvantages, which would become more apparent later, including, for example, challenges with reliability, call quality, consistency, and security in certain networks configurations. Skype was officially launched in August 2003. Its value proposition of free or cheap calls quickly resonated with internet users around the world. And their user-friendly interface, coupled with the novelty and cost savings of internet-based calling, fueled rapid adoption. Within a few months, Skype had millions of users. By 2005, it had surpassed 50 million registered users, particularly in Europe and Asia. And the phrase "to Skype" quickly entered the lexicon as a verb for making a video call. Now, their early growth strategies focused on word-of-mouth marketing, leveraging that viral nature of a free communication tool. But as broadband internet became more widespread, so Skype's ability to offer relatively high-quality voice and later video calls over standard internet connections became a major draw. And then the introduction of features like instant messaging, file sharing, and voicemail further enhanced its appeal as a comprehensive communication tool. So by 2010, Skype had over 600 million registered users and was handling a significant percentage of the world's international voice traffic. Its impact on traditional telecom companies, particularly on their international call revenue, was substantial. Now, their experience that they gained during the development and operation of Kazaa, in particular, was directly transferred. Now, the experience that they'd gained during developing and operating Kazaa was directly transferable and provided the foundations for Skype in several key ways. First of all, they understood how to manage and build an effective P2P network architecture. They'd got deep expertise in building and managing those complex networks. They'd learned how to design protocols, not least the fast track protocol, that allowed individual computers to find each other, to share each other's information using They learned how to design protocols that allowed individual computers, the peers, to find each other and share information. And then they could transfer information, transfer directly. They learned how to design protocols that allowed individual computers, peers, to find each other, share information, and transfer data directly or via third-party relays. And this was a radical departure from the traditional client-server model which dominated most internet applications at that time. It was also valuable in terms of learning how to handle scale and balance load. P2P networks, by their nature, distribute the workload across all the connected users. So with millions of users on Kazaa, the team gained valuable experience in building a system that could scale rapidly without requiring massive centralized server infrastructure. They learned how to manage network traffic, optimize the data routing between peers, and maintain the network stability, even with fluctuating numbers of users joining and leaving. So these lessons were directly applicable to building a voice and video communication network that needed to handle real-time data flow between potentially millions of concurrent calls. And they learned a lot about building robust and resilient systems. Decentralized networks are inherently more resilient to single points of failure than centralized systems, which can all go down. Here, if one server goes down in a traditional model, the service can be disrupted. But in a well-designed P2P network, the failure of a few peers doesn't cripple the entire network. The Kazaa experience taught the team how to build a P2P system that could maintain functionality even when parts of the network were unstable or when individual users went offline. Now, this robustness was a critical device for a communication tool like Skype, where, after all, call reliability is paramount. They also learned over time with Kazaa and later Skype how to manage decentralization, because P2P networks present unique technical hurdles, such as network address translation, traversal, They also learned to navigate many of the challenges around decentralization. P2P networks have their own technical hurdles, such as translating user addresses for many addresses, getting connections to work when users are behind routers or firewalls, and ensuring efficient discovery of other users. Now, the Kazaa developers had to solve these complex networking problems, and of course, the solutions they developed for that kind of file sharing could be adapted for the demands of real-time voice and video, Skype. They also, of course, had experience with disruptive innovation and working against established industries. Both file sharing and voice over IP were highly disruptive technologies that challenged existing industries. In the case of Kazaa, music and film. In the case of Skype, telecommunications. Now, the legal battles and the industry resistance which they'd faced with Kazaa gave them a good preparation for the regulatory and competitive hurdles that they were going to face with Skype. More importantly, the technical prowess which they developed in creating a system that could circumvent traditional distribution channels for files was directly applicable to bypassing traditional networks for voice calls. It all sounds like a fairy tale success story, a classic unicorn narrative in which entrepreneurs achieve unimaginable growth at high speed through their brilliant ideas. But success brings its own challenges. And even back in their early halcyon days, the seeds of Skype's eventual demise were being sown. Several factors contributed to the eventual fading of this star. First of all, acquisitions and strategic shifts. Skype was First of all, the challenge of being acquired. Skype was acquired by eBay in 2005 for $2.6 First, the challenge which comes when you're so successful you become a target for acquisition. Skype was acquired by eBay in 2005 for $2.6 billion, with the idea of integrating it into the eBay marketplace to facilitate communication between buyers and sellers. Great idea, but this integration never fully materialized. So eBay later sold a majority stake in Skype in 2009. Significantly, Zennström and Friis were part of the consortium which bought it back, with a view this time to selling it on. And they succeeded in attracting the interest of players like Google and Microsoft. And in 2011, Microsoft acquired Skype for then a colossal $8.5 billion. So this gave Skype significant resources and the possibility of integration into Microsoft's products like Outlook or Xbox Live and of course Windows. But it also marked a shift in focus. The original P2P architecture was gradually replaced with a more centralized, albeit cloud-based system to improve reliability and security. Unfortunately, the transition reportedly led to technical issues and a perceived decline in call quality for some users. Of course, there was also increasing competition. As internet-based communication became mainstream, the competitive landscape exploded. New players like Google with their Hangouts, WhatsApp, Viber, Telegram, later Zoom and Microsoft Teams, all of these players entered the market, often offering simpler interfaces, better mobile experiences, more focused feature sets like group video conferencing, all sorts of things. And Skype struggled to innovate and adapt quickly enough to the rapid pace of the particularly mobile-first era and the evolving needs of consumers and business users. With the shock of the COVID-19 pandemic came a massive push towards connecting via the online world, as quarantine regulations forced people out of offices and out of direct social contact. But despite having laid the foundations just for such online communications, Skype took something of a backseat compared to other platforms which were better able to offer what people wanted at that time. There were also challenging user experience issues. Over time, Skype's interface became a little more cluttered with the addition of too many features. It led to a less intuitive user experience compared to some of those leaner competitors. And frequent updates, design changes also alienated some long-time users. There were continuing integration challenges, particularly Microsoft trying to link its products, offering the potential but not the execution. And just as with eBay, Microsoft found integration challenges. Whilst its many products offered potential linking up, their execution wasn't always seamless. And there was an overlap in functionality with other Microsoft communication tools. Things like Lync, which evolved into Skype for Business, and then Teams, which really superseded things but added to the confusion. Particularly, Microsoft's emphasis on Teams as a platform designed for workplace collaboration began to challenge the way that Skype had worked. Teams integrated chat, video, meetings, file storage, application integration. It grew rapidly, especially in the enterprise space, and it was bundled with Microsoft's 365 subscription. So this was a different strategic push, which within Microsoft effectively developed Teams, but sidelined Skype as a primary communication tool, particularly in the business market. Now, Skype is by no means dead, though the brand has been put out to grass. Its technology and functionality continue to exist within Microsoft's ecosystem. But that distinctive blue and white logo is no more. In its prime, Skype made distance irrelevant for millions, connected families, friends, and colleagues across borders with voice and later video calls that were once prohibitively expensive, but now available to all. It played a crucial role in popularizing VoIP, voice over IP technology, and paved the way for those many conferencing platforms we see today. The technical ingenuity behind the P2P network, born out of those early experiences with file sharing and Kazaa, that provided a significant step in leveraging the internet for real-time communication. Now, there's a danger with innovation that we're always attracted to the new, and we forget quickly what went before. But without the efforts of Zennström, Friis, and their friends, we might have had a very different range of online interaction available to us. So, spare a fond thought for Skype, perhaps even humming the melody from Tom's Diner as you do so. Whatever else, the Skype story offers a number of lessons about how innovation happens, and plenty of clues about how to leverage this knowledge and whatever else, the Skype story offers a number of lessons about how innovation happens and plenty of clues about how to leverage this knowledge. In particular, first, it reminds us of Joseph Schumpeter's well-worn observation that entrepreneurship drives growth, but also that when other entrepreneurs see the first mover, they too will be driven to follow. And this swarming effect, as Schumpeter called it, means that individual advantage is competed away, and those new entrants may have more to offer in terms of resources to develop the innovation further. So there's a choice for the founder firm to stay in the game or move on, as Zennström and Friis did when the waters around Kazaa became too turbulent, both from a competitive and from a legal point of view. And the Skype story also demonstrates the power of a knowledge-based business. Even though they let go of a profitable music industry venture, they were able to redeploy the considerable knowledge which they gained around P2P networking in the new field of telecommunications. Their real capital was in the team of developers and the informal networks around this emerging technology. And they invested well into a new opportunity. Interestingly, this continues to be a source of opportunity creation. TransferWise has been a major force in financial services, but it builds extensively on a new financial services model with a decentralized network basis. It was created by one of the Skype developers. Now, for large organizations looking to leverage the agility of successful startups, there's a cautionary message here. Simply having the deep pockets with which to acquire those new businesses is only half the story. As eBay, and to a lesser extent Microsoft, found out, the real challenge comes in unlocking the additional value which is on offer. And that comes through careful strategic integration. Absorptive capacity becomes a key issue, and it's often the rock on which otherwise promising acquisitions will actually founder. Skype, of course, is also a classic story of disruptive innovation, with entrepreneurs challenging powerful incumbents from the edge of their businesses. Kazaa was one of many minnows challenging the profitable core business model of the music industry by working with a fringe market. And Skype once again challenged from the edge the strong control of the telecoms industry. And it found new tech-savvy markets around that edge who were eager for cheaper connectivity using decentralized networks. Classic disruptive innovation. But finally, the story reminds us of the power of entrepreneurial insight and energy, which spots opportunities and sometimes manages to turn them into significant value. Maybe there's something in those cold Baltic waters which flicks this entrepreneurial switch on. Certainly, the subsequent experiences of the founding team don't provide a picture of people resting on their laurels or munching the grass contentedly in the retirement field. In 2006, Niklas Zennström set up the kind of investment fund which he hadn't been able to find when he was founding Skype. His Atomico fund has a very good track record of success, and it's spawned other unicorns, such as Klarna. It's now looking to the field of climate change mitigation as another source of opportunity. Janus Friis has been similarly active, not least in founding Starship. It's a company producing self-driving delivery robots. And their first employee and one of the co-developers of Skype, the Estonian Tarvel Heikus, was one of the founders of TransferWise, which, as I say, was a currency exchange platform which has helped transform international banking. But he's not alone. Former employees of Skype have founded nearly 1,910 companies, including 15 unicorns, startups valued at more than $1 billion. Skype may be gone, but it certainly won't be forgotten.